Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to look at the three biggest Protestant arch-heretics and juxtapose how they viewed the Virgin Mary with how many of their successors in the Protestant world view the Virgin Mary today. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et secula seculorum. Amen. I'll put in some banners for the various Mary episodes that we have here. Probably out of the 400, we maybe have 8 or 9, but I have one on the 4 Marian dogmas that all Catholics must believe to be a Catholic. We also have a video here on Protestant misconceptions of Mary. Of course, the biggest one is that we worship her as a goddess and so forth. Look, in short, for any Protestants or lapsed Catholics, we do not worship the Virgin Mary. We do have a video on the difference between dulia, hyperdulia, and latria, the 3 forms of worship. And the only one that is true worship is latria, and that's only reserved for the Trinity. Dulia and hyperdulia and protodulia, which we give to St. Joseph's, are more of just venerating and respecting. And the Virgin Mary deserves that. The Virgin Mary is the Theotokos. That's one of the Marian dogmas that was promulgated in 430 something AD in the Council of Ephesus. So most Protestants would agree that she is the Mother of God because they believe Jesus is a part of the Trinity. And I think when you look at the Marian dogmas, I think Immaculate Conception, Assumption, and so forth, perpetual virginity. I think if you're talking to a Protestant, just start with the Theotokos, start with the Mother of God, because unless they're part of the cult, one of the Protestant cults, they're going to concede that Mary is the Mother of God. And as such, we respect her and honor her. And we use the term venerate, which is to essentially respect and honor her. She is the vessel from which Jesus, the new Adam, came. She is the new Eve. He is the new Adam. And she is worthy of respect, and she has been seen this way since the earliest church. I mean, we have an episode here on the Didache. Didache was probably written in the late first century decade, 80, 90 AD, only 50, 60 years after Jesus died. And in there you can see the veneration of Mary. We have episodes on the Apostolic Fathers, the Patristic Fathers like Clement of Rome and Ignatius of Antioch, and the early Church Fathers venerated Mary. And it's understandable. But either way, we're going to look at 3 of the Protestant arch-heretics. Now, of course, Protestants would call these guys reformers, but by the strictest definition of canon law, both Calvin, Luther, and Ulrich Zwingli were heretics. Only Catholics who preach open contradiction to the deposit of faith can be considered a heretic. So Protestant, someone who's born a Protestant, really, you can't use the term heretic on them. You can only use the term heretic. And we have an episode here on the difference between a formal heretic and a material heretic. But you can only use the term heretic on someone who was baptized and was raised a Catholic. And all of these 3 arch-heretics were raised Catholic and were even priests. So in the 16th century, as the Protestant Revolution was occurring, all 3 of these guys still held veneration to the Virgin Mary. And we're going to look at some of these quotes. And you juxtapose that with the typical Protestant of today who has and again, it's so hard to speak for denominationalism because there's literally thousands of these splinter groups everywhere. But you can certainly find a large majority of Protestants that, and I know converts, and I can't say like the converts I know speak for all the Protestants, but they're like, we just don't really think of Mary. We think about Mary and Christmas for the nativity narrative, and we just don't get why, at the least, the more moderate is, we just don't get why the Catholics and Orthodox care so much about Mary. And of course, on the other side of the oscillation of the pendulum is you worship Mary. You know, Mary is a co-goddess and so forth. Just co-god and so forth. But you see this like today, like they've totally forgot how their Protestant progenitors, if you want to call them, respected Mary. So let's look at Martin Luther. Quote, "The veneration of Mary is inscribed in the very depths of the human heart." Martin Luther said that. John Calvin, quote, "It cannot be denied that God, in choosing and destining Mary to be the mother of his son, granted her the highest honor." Highest honor. We honor her. We venerate her. Hyperdulia. Ulrich Zwingli, he was a priest, just like Luther was a priest. "I esteem immensely the Mother of God, the ever chaste, immaculate Virgin Mary." Ever chaste. Perpetual virginity. Ulrich Zwingli. So you see the three big reformers, whatever you want to call them, of the early Reformation, the 1520s, 1530s, proclaiming the beauty that is the Virgin Mary. And again, this kind of goes to the telephone game. You guys are all familiar with the telephone game. You say something to somebody and it goes around, and by the time it comes around, it's not what the original message was. And I think you can kind of use this analogy with Protestants today when it comes to the role of Mary or the veneration of Mary, is most of them don't understand, because of all these centuries past and how Protestantism, and look at Luther. Luther believed in the real presence. Luther and Zwingli were always fighting, because Zwingli, I think a lot of these were little things. Like Zwingli got his start on preaching against why do we have to fast during Lent. And it started with something kind of minor than that. Then it was like, well, priests should be able to marry. And if you look at Luther, Luther married a former nun later on. He was on board with that. And then he's like, yeah, the real presence isn't true. And then Luther's like, you're from Satan. I think I think I'm going to do a video on the book Luther and the False Brethren, because Luther is just, anytime you don't agree with Luther, he says you're from the devil, right? How convenient is that? Either way, so Luther and Zwingli are fighting because Luther believes in the real presence, and they're fighting in correspondence or in public sermons or treatises or whatever they're writing, and Zwingli is not, and they're just fighting and fighting. And then Calvin comes in a generation later, is like, well, I'll find this middle ground. But either way, so you see from all these three guys believe that Mary held a special role, being the mother of Jesus Christ. And you see as the centuries pass, and as all these groups splinter to splinter, Calvin's the part of the reforms like Presbyterianism and Lutheranism and so forth, how they all splinter to what we have today, where the Protestants, and this is not shocking because Protestants as a whole are not good with history. They're not good with the history of the church. They're certainly not good with the early church, the patristic era, the first 400 or 500 years after Christ died. And many of them, and it is no fault of their own, because their pastors will cherry pick what they want them to read, will only know certain things about what their arch-heretic progenitor taught about, let's say Luther, for example. And so if the church of the 10th Baptist Street on Main Street is teaching a certain thing on Mary, they're going to conveniently not maybe mention that Zwingli held Mary in high regard, right? Because that's how far they've gotten from their original progenitors, is they don't even know that their original progenitors had no problem with Mary. So anytime you go to a church where they have a major problem with Mary, I would just tell them, it's like, hey, just find the quote on whatever church this is, or just give them the quote of all three that I've mentioned. Just be like, hey, they understood Mary's role. You're the one who has a problem understanding Mary's role. And if you believe that Jesus Christ is the second part of the Trinity, the Son of God, and is a God, of course, then why do you have a problem with Mary being held on a high level and being respected and venerated? And then remind them, of course, nowhere, and we have a video on this, show me or prove it. These are the two basic apologetic tools any Catholic can use. When they're like, well, you worship Mary. Okay, show me. Show me in any Catholic text, especially like the Catechism, but anywhere, anything with any form of imprimatur that it says the Catholic Church worships Mary. Now, they'll pull out Protestant books that say that we worship Mary, but we don't. Obviously, it's like, find a Catholic. So show me. And they can't show you. So in all charity, Protestants who are watching this, understand there's always a Catholic bias, right? Understand that maybe you were raised thinking that we worship Mary as a goddess, and we don't. There's always going to be exceptions, right? You're going to find somebody in Colombia who's been, some peasant who's been improperly catechized who might, but the Catholic Church has never taught that Mary is some sort of goddess. Never taught that. And understand that your Protestant progenitor, arch-heretic founders believed and venerated and respected Mary, and you should too, because she is the Mother of God. Guys, post in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Hit the notification, subscribe, and share button. Until next time, take care, God bless, and pray.